This is session 3. For those of you that I don't know, I'm John Hitchin. We at Renaisi have been running this for a few months now off the back of some work that we did a little while ago, which I'll talk about in one sec. So today we've got Tom Neumark is going to talk to us a little bit about changing communities. We were due to have Steph from Leeds and Bradford, brain freeze.
Community Foundation.
Community Foundations, thank you, Lily. But she unfortunately has to attend a funeral today, so we've just got Tom, but I'm sure he can. He'll be plenty good enough, and there's lots of interesting things there. But also, I know that many of you from previous conversations we've had will have lots to bring to this conversation too. So what we'll do is, rather like the last one where we had 2 presenters and then we kind of opened out into conversation, we'll do a kind of give Tom some time to talk through some kind of responses, reflections and comparisons, people bringing their experiences in response, I suppose, to what Tom talks about. And then depending on where the conversation goes, I'd like us to try and sort of think about some of the principles that have come out of that conversation, but we'll see how the conversation goes. I'm not going to talk through all of this because many of you have seen different versions of this slide, but this work really comes off the back of something that we published back, well, a long time ago now. I think it was 2019 actually, rather than 2020, or did we start it in 2019 and published it in 2020? Anyway, in partnership with Save the Children and a number of other charities that tried to think through what place-based systemic change was and how to fund it. He got a working definition of what we and the partners that we worked with it had for what place-based systemic change is, and we came up with this framework. The idea of that framework being that there are lots of examples, lots of ways in, lots of different approaches and different organizational types that could work in this sort of way, but that there were levels, not necessarily always not always experienced in a perfectly linear way, but there were levels of movement of practice towards systemic working in place. And one of the things that there were 2 things really that came out of the back of that research was we needed to understand a little bit more about funders and how they could work practically to support this. And we're continuing to talk to a few funders about that. I'm working with some in some of our consultancy work, but we also wanted to provide an opportunity for places to come together to talk more about their practice. And that is what birthed this community practice. And so we've had 3 sessions. So one we talked a little bit about what draws people to this sort of work, and that, place-based systemic change and me was the title for it, and what skills people have and what they bring to it. And that merged into and overlapped a little bit with, but was also distinct from the second session, which was about teams and how when you bring those individual perspectives together, how do you build a team? What skills do you need? What experiences you need? And how does that team fit together? With both the place that it is working in, but also the host organization. So that host organization might be the team might be the organization. It might be a small organization that does just this, and therefore it's kind of less of an issue, but it might be a small team within a massive charity. It might be, and everything in between. And so we had 2, really, really great conversations, I thought, and we shared some outputs from that. And then today we're going to trying to take it a little bit away from just the team and being quite so insular, and talk about something that has come up in a number of conversations that we have in our work at Renaisi, but also I know in tons of the conversations that I've had with some of you independently, is the idea of change. And when I was talking to Tom and Steph about this idea, and a few other people as well, what it reminded me of a kind of something that I wrote a couple of years ago, and how about the problems of thinking about place, and I wrote a number of different problems for thinking about place, and why it's not always the right approach to think about policy or work. But one of them was this, that it encourages us to forget that the community and the place changes. you talk about, oh, we're going to work with the community, as if that's one block that doesn't do anything differently, that is the same thing over time. But we all know in reality that whether it's where we live or work or whatever, that places are shaped by movement. And that for me kind of begs a number of questions, which I sent round to all of you as a sort of some things for you to reflect on, but it begs for me questions about how we respond to change. What does that mean around questions of equity? And what does it mean for the different kinds of relationships and formations of power that we support and create or discourage or work with in this kind of work? So there's a bunch of things in those conversations that I thought could be really fertile ground for us as a group to just start kicking around. What does that mean? What does that mean for our practices? What I'm proposing is that we sort of see where this session goes, and we could have some follow-up sessions that are a little bit more focused on maybe one part of this, depending on where everyone's interest is. So before I hand over to Tom, I just wonder if there are any kind of questions or things that people want to ask or understand or reflect on before I hand over. I can't see any hands up, so just shout, because we're a small enough group. Okay, I'm going to take that silence as a no. And so I'm going to stop sharing now and hand over to Tom Neumark. So by way of introduction, I've known Tom for quite a long time. Renaisi was working with Tom in his last role. So he's just moved role. He'll tell you about this in a sec. But his last role was Chief Executive of the Peel in Clerkenwell in South Islington. And that's, he'll tell you all about that community. But it's particularly interesting to me, and because my first job at Renaisi was working on the community, the New Deal for Communities programme, so 10-year massive investment in Bunhill and Clerkenwell in the south of Islington. So as we start to talk a little bit about change, I might chip in with some things about what's changed from when I worked in that community and how things have evolved. So without further ado, hand over to Tom.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you so much to Renaisi for inviting me to speak here. It's a real pleasure to be able to share some of my experiences. The flat downstairs are having their drains done today, so if you hear incredibly loud drain-related noises downstairs, it's nothing to do with me and it's not my fault. It's lovely also to be presenting to you, although terrifyingly, as I look at the faces now, a number of people I not only know, but also respect that I'm talking in front of. So obviously my imposter syndrome is going through the roof. And so the way I'm going to be dealing with that is I'm mostly going to tell a few stories from my time at the Peel. So you can't blame me because these are things that really happened. And then I will try and draw out some of the questions and maybe observations from those stories. And those bits you probably can disagree with me quite firmly. So for the past 4 years, as John said, I was running a community development charity in Clerkenwell. So Clerkenwell's a neighbourhood, it's a ward, it's a place, it's a variety of things, and it's particular in a number of ways, and then in a number of ways working in there tells us something about place-based working. So I'm going to put up a few slides just as kind of aid memoirs to make sure I know what I'm talking about. He said very boldly. So I'm going to put up a few charts now, a bit about some of the changes that had taken place in Clerkenwell. I mean, when we were given the invite to this, I think there was particular interest in looking at ethnicity and age. And these are obviously big things that have changed in a number of neighbourhoods. They change different ways in different neighbourhoods. And I think the different ways those change also is very, very important for any place-based working. So I've done a couple of charts. I'd say it by way of caveat up front. this is fairly quick and dirty analysis. I wouldn't want you to say, oh, it's actually 2%, not 3%, or what the rest of it. But I think it gives you indication a bit about how that neighbourhood of Clerkenwell, which is an inner London neighbourhood, a bit about how it's changed over the past 20, 30 years. So in common with lots of inner city neighbourhoods, it's become a lot more ethnically diverse than it was in the early 90s. So the orange chart that you can see on your on that screen is the percentage of the different ethnic groups in 1991, and then the blue one is 2011. It's using census data, and so you can see there's a higher percentage of the groups are not white, and a very significant chunk of the white population is non-British now. And that's a change, over 20 years. And I would imagine when the 2021 census data comes out, there'll be a lower percentage of white British, and the other one, ethnic groups, will also have increased. In terms of age, what we've got is a lower percentage of people who are under 18 and a lower percentage of people who are over 65, and a much higher percentage of people who are 18 to 44. I think already you're starting to get a bit of a feeling of the type of changes that might be happening in that neighborhood. It wasn't in the bit of the brief that I read, but I thought it was important to throw in a bit about class here. So one of the things that's resulted in is there's basically as many households on high incomes as there are on low incomes in Clerkenwell. And that's a significant change over the past couple of decades. One of the stats I used to illustrate that is just between the 2001 census and the 2011 census, the AB1s increased by 50%. So in just 10 years, there were that many more kind of affluent professionals coming into the neighbourhood. But Islington Council was very hot on preserving council housing. So it wasn't that the people on lower incomes were displaced. It was much more people on middle incomes were displaced, and private renting became a lot more expensive. And so these are just some ways of illustrating some of the changes that took place in the community. And then to try and make it a bit more personal, I've tried to organise some stories that I'm going to tell now along three themes: the past, present, and future. So here's a word cloud about some of the things people say about Clerkenwell when we talk to them. And one of the things I quite like is you see lots of opposite words up there. So you see safe and unsafe. You'll see like old and young up there, caring and antisocial behaviour and stuff like that, which I think gives you a sense of that change and how the change informs people. So stories about the past. Here are three stories. Number one, I remember a guy talking to me, and he'd lived in that area for a very long time, to the point where he remembered the municipality of Finsbury before the local authority reorganisation in the 70s, when it wasn't part of Islington Council, it was part of Finsbury Council. This was a very municipal socialist authority. They built a lot of flats, they ran a lot of flats, and he said to me, I knew the director of housing by name then, whereas these days you go to the council, da, 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 da. And then I remember talking to a second guy called Lennox. He set up a tenant management organisation in the Brunswick estate. He came over to Clerkenwell from the Caribbean, where he was born, in the 70s. It was an exclusively white estate that he moved into there. And he said the kids would throw rocks at him as he walked down the street. And he was like, nothing like that happens anymore. And then the third story, I was talking to a woman called Sarah, who's on the Finsbury estate, and she was talking about the Exmouth Market, which some of you will know, which is a great kind of brunch spot, and got Morrow restaurant and places like that on it now. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was a kind of fruit and veg and bric-a-brac market. And she said to me, well, it was shit, but at least I could go. And I think these are very, very different views about the past, what that neighborhood meant, than what it means now. But they're very infused by the changing racial, class, age, makeup of that area. Here are some stories about the present then. I was speaking to a mum at the school gate, 3 generations of Clerkenwell. And she said to me, it's just so quiet here now on the weekends. And I started asking her a bit more about that. And she said to me, well, all the bars and cafes, this is when bars and cafes were things, all the bars and cafes are set up for people from architects or lawyers or people who are working in LinkedIn after work. And then none of them are set up to do anything on the weekend. I remember we were running a summer play scheme for kind of older primary school kids, and a parent came up to me and they were thinking about enrolling their child in the scheme. And they said to me, well, will there be anyone rough? Will there be any of the rough kids on this scheme? They didn't really know the word, what was politically correct word to use for what they were trying to describe. And they were a bit reticent to come forward with the language, but it was a big concern of theirs because they know it's a mixed area. And there are certain places they felt welcome and safe, and there are other ones that they really didn't feel welcome and safe. And then I always thought that was interesting to contrast it with what a lot of the older gentrifiers, you might call them, would say to me, people who moved in the 90s and noughties and now had like really settled in there. They would always say to me, I love the diversity. That's what they'd always say. I love the mix of people. And then obviously when you talked with them, they wouldn't necessarily do any mixing with those people. In fact, they wouldn't actually have that much to do with the neighborhood at all because they are middle class people living in inner London. So they'd be as likely to go to the West End or Waterloo or Angel or go out east or go and see friends on the South Bank or whatever it might be. But they really liked that about how they felt about the neighborhood, they would say. And so then I got a few stories about the future. So there was a mostly disused car park on the Farringdon Road, massive building. And it was going to get knocked down, and the developer was looking for planning permission to build a hotel. And there was a local campaign from the social housing estate that just backed onto it. We don't want that to get planning permission. It's going to be building works forever, But the way they phrased it was, whatever gets put there, it will be £5 coffees. And pretty soon it's all going to be £5 coffees around here, which I think really showed me a bit about how they felt about the future of that place, how it's going, what's the direction, and how they fit in, really, what their place was in that future. Then this was a very common refrain. I couldn't tie it down to just one person. A lot of people would say to me, poor are getting poorer and the rich are getting richer. The leader of the council at the time, Richard Watts, said to me, every rich person that moves out, an even richer person moves in, and every poor person that moves out, an even poorer person gets in. And there was this sense of nothing could be done about that. That's the facts of the world. And it's just getting more and more extreme and exaggerated. There's no modifying force in that. And it was a very, very bad thing. And then I think quite a different thing that someone saying to me, they're like a community sort. And she said to me, people do mix well on her estate. There's quite a strong sense of community there. And she was saying, but the middle class people, they don't want to come down here. Come down here is literally true in the case of Clerkenwell. There's the Amwell that's on a hill that's like a fancier neighborhood, and you kind of walk down the hill to get to the mass housing estates. And there was a real sense with some people of like, there are long-standing residents of Clerkenwell. And we've been here forever, and we're not going anywhere, and we look after our own and we stick together. Whereas there are these more newcomer rich people who just pass through, and they might be here until they're going to have kids, and then they move on, and they're not really part of things. We're the real Clerkenwell or Farringdon or EC1 or whatever they would call it. I mean, hopefully those stories are a bit provocative and give a bit of personality to some of the changing, the way you have to work with changing communities. I think there are some implications that I would draw out from that. And one is those changes that Clerkenwell has been experiencing, you might broadly describe as gentrification, but it's not solely gentrification. It's also, there's a degree of it becoming a much more ethnically diverse neighborhood. And the history of that is, for the largest time, there was what you could characterize as a racist council housing allocation policy. Another way of saying that would be, you know, your great-great-grandfather had to have a council flat or whatever before you got one. And so, unlike lots of other parts of London, even in the 80s, council housing was being given out to white people. That started changing with the various court rules, and then you know the history of housing law will know that started changing at the same time as obviously London in general started changing, and we had different types of immigration coming to the country. So we had that going on. At the same time, we had changing nature of the economy in London. And so you suddenly go from an area that was traditionally a kind of artisan area, it's kind of famous for watchmaking back in the day, Clerkenwell, to being now, it's got the most architects in the world, or whatever the stat would be. LinkedIn's headquarters are there. And we also know, we obviously saw the absolute boom in the city, and Clerkenwell's just a hop, skip and a jump from there. So a lot of people wanting to move in there. So these are big changes that are happening in all across the world, not just in London. And the question for me, as someone who's working in a place, is, so what's our attitude towards these changes? Are we trying to accelerate them? Like, do we think that's fantastic? There's more diverse people from more diverse ethnic groups coming into this neighborhood. That's great. Let's go with that. Let's accelerate it. Let's make it a more welcoming place. Let's go with it. Is it mitigation? Are we thinking these changes, there's nothing much we can do to stop them or to speed them up, but there's challenges that come with that, like a lack of community cohesion. So we have to do something to mop that up, to try and deal with some of the negative bits of that. Or is it emergence? Are we like trying to really continually stir the pot in that neighborhood and be like, it's very fluid, dynamic place, and we're trying to create something from the sum of its parts by bumping things together and seeing how things come up? Or is it resistance? Are we saying, look, we're an anti-gentrification organization. We want to actually take over some of the businesses here and run them as community businesses. We want to try taking over some of the housing stock and making sure it's preserved as social housing. So that changing context, I think we had to decide which of those are we going to be. And I think it's very hard to be more than one of those, because they lead you in quite different directions. I think related to that is the extent to which those changes mean people's certain identities are very much to the fore when they're thinking about what they're going to do in a place like Clerkenwell. And people will very quickly associate any given activity with an identity, and they'll think, is it for me? And now at first, we were very against excluding people. And we were very keen. We want the things we do to be welcoming and welcoming for everyone. And what we learned quite quickly was that meant that we didn't really know who we were excluding, and we weren't consciously examining who we were excluding, but we were excluding people. And so I've put here a quote early days from when we did some research. It said, people attracts people. Appeal attracts people mostly from social housing. And we weren't consciously doing that at the time. We weren't like only flyering the local estates. We were, for example, saying, we're running a club for over 55s. And already that's excluding people. Obviously, we're saying 54 and younger aren't allowed. But something about how we were running it, something about how we were perceived, something about our identity was tied with a more long-standing, more working class, more white identity in the area. Now, we weren't being conscious about saying, we're not going to have middle class people here, but that's what we were doing. And so I think we moved from that to try and think about, well, who are we really going to try and include here? And therefore, who are we going to exclude to a certain extent? And I think we came to that, I don't know if it's right or wrong, we came to that view on the basis of it's better to be conscious about those things than unconscious, and to do it as a shared decision making. Now, the final thing I would highlight up is a bit about the data on this. We found it very hard to have kind of timely, reliable information about who lives in the area. You can see even from the charts that I pulled up, it's like census data from 10 years ago. Maybe other people have it. We certainly found it very hard to get. Now, lots of people would give me opinions about how the neighborhood was changing, but I often thought those opinions were not to be treated solely as kind of dispassionate census type information. And they often as much told you about people's attitude towards the change as the reality of the change. So I remember working years back on an estate in the suburbs of Manchester, and a tenant activist there saying to me, they weren't racist, they're not at all racist, they certainly weren't racist, and they would love their estate to be very welcoming to all people, but they felt they were being targeted disproportionately for new ethnic minority tenants. But then when I talked to the housing association, they had less than 1% ethnic minority tenants. And what was clear was he, for his own reasons, he was very aware of, vigilant. Any new tenant who came in who wasn't white, he really saw them, they really stood out. All the white people who moved in, he didn't really bat an eyelid. And so you get these stories in any neighborhood about the changes that are happening and what we should do about it. And I never necessarily thought they gave me some kind of statistical reality of Clerkenwell, but they did tell me about how people felt about certain aspects of the change, and a bit about what their identity is as well, and what identity was being kind of activated and flared up and fired up by some aspects of those change. So those were some stories about working in a place and some of the implications that that I drew out from them. I'd be really happy to answer kind of specific questions, or for it to be a kind of starting point for discussion and conversation. So once again, thank you very much for listening to me. Really looking forward to the conversation now.